Welcome back, everyone. Hope everybody has enjoyed their summer. I'll be your host tonight. Mark is not available because he's home doing baby watch. Any day now, you'll expect a new baby boy. And as of Sunday, everything was going very, very well. Could be any time for a new baby boy in Mark's family. So it's great to be able to open up our season with someone who has become a very good friend over the years, Megan Kate Nelson, an outstanding historian who has been with us on 3 prior occasions. She's the author of 4 books, including The Three-Cornered War, for which she was named as the first finalist in 2021 for the Pulitzer Prize in history. The Pulitzer Prize. Tonight, Megan will discuss her latest book, Saving Yellowstone, published this year. I saw an interview this morning with Ken Burns. He was talking about his special 3-part series on PBS, United States and the Holocaust. And he was talking about stories help us understand our history. And that's what Megan does so well. Like some of the real great writers like David McCullough and Nathaniel Philbrick, weaving stories into a cohesive whole. The Library Journal and others have recently reviewed her book, Saving Yellowstone, and they indicated that Megan is a masterful storyteller. Her book is a must-read for anyone who appreciates deep research and a powerful narrative. It's a testimonial to her mastery of the subject and her storytelling skill. So it's a great pleasure tonight to welcome back, once again, Megan Kate Nelson.
That was lovely. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. It's great to see you in person. I know I saw you over Zoom 2 years ago, which was fine. But this is much, much better, right?
Don't lean back to your head.
And is the mic working and everything?
The mic is working fine.
Great. I don't want to blow you out of the room. And thank you, of course, as always, to Bob for the invitation to come back and talk to you about this new book, which I promise, even though it takes place in the middle of Reconstruction, it has deep roots in Civil War history, which I will explain as we go along. As I mentioned, I was here 2 years ago to talk about The Three-Cornered War, which had just come out right before the pandemic. I had 4 good weeks of talks before that all got shut down. And I wrote the majority of Saving Yellowstone during the pandemic from my own living room. So I'm going to talk about that in a second here too. But the idea for Saving Yellowstone actually came from The Three-Cornered War. This often happens with me. I'll be researching and writing one book, and then I'll be like, oh, here's the idea for the next book. And this actually directly came from my research. If you remember from Three-Cornered War, John Clark, who was the Surveyor General of New Mexico Territory, Lincoln's appointee, and the representative of the Republican Party in New Mexico Territory. And so I was, researching him and researching the history of surveying. And I ran across, again, Ferdinand Hayden and the survey in 1871, which I had first studied in an art history class in grad school. Because as you will see, visual art came out of this survey that has been enduring and really canonical. Also, the events in the Far West that I talk about in The Three-Cornered War actually provided the conditions for what I'm going to talk about in Saving Yellowstone. Yellowstone would not have been preserved in 1872 as the world's first national park if those events in the Far West, the fights between the Union and the Confederacy, and then the fights between the U.S. Army and Native peoples had not happened. Also, just as the Three-Cornered War kind of asked the question, what happens when we look at the Civil War from the Far West? Does it change the way that we see the war? Does it change the questions that we have about it and its significance? Saving Yellowstone is asking, what happens if we look at Reconstruction? These chaotic years kind of after the Civil War from Yellowstone. Does it change our whole perception of that Reconstruction period which is a really important period that we don't talk about often enough. And does it change our understanding of Yellowstone itself as an iconic American landscape? So as you know, as some of you may know, I am not from Austin. I am from the West. Originally, I first went to Yellowstone when I was 10 years old. Here I am with my extremely annoying brother. In 1982, so 40 years ago, July of 1982, we went on those epic car drive vacations, and so Yellowstone was actually our first stop. We drove from Denver to Jackson, Wyoming in one day, spent one night at Grand Teton, and then went into Yellowstone and had this big trip that included Glacier, it included other spots in Canada. We ended up coming back around and going to the Custer Battlefield and driving back home. So this is us in that epic moment. And until I had not actually returned until last year around this time. So I have not been there in 40 years, but I remembered it fondly. I started to research Saving Yellowstone, as I noted before, in the summer of 2019, and I had written like a chapter or two, and was actually in the National Archives, looking at all of the records from the Hayden expedition, which he had to turn in, because this expedition was federally funded, so he had to keep all of his records and give them back to the government. So I was in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, right in the middle of a 2-week planned research trip. One of the archivists came, said, you're going to need to get whatever you need to get done because we are shutting down because of the pandemic. So this was March 13th, 2020. That was my first and only research trip for Saving Yellowstone. I was able to access all of the other documents that I needed online. So this is one of the great revolutions of the last 10 years in historical research, that we have so many great digital resources at our fingertips. It also helped that a lot of the records I was looking at were federal records. So they had been digitized. I got access to them through a friend in this amazing searchable database of a congressional serial set, which was word searchable. So I could look up my people. I could look up Ferdinand Hayden, and I would see every time he was mentioned in any kind of report. A Department of War report, his letters, any kinds of orders from any officers in the field who were tasked with giving him supplies, all of that stuff. It was really amazing. So this is just a list of the kinds of sources that I was looking at. Government documents. I did finally end up making a site visit. This is a photograph of me kind of standing above the Yellowstone River. This whole area, by the way, was completely flooded in that June flood. So that was alarming to kind of see those pictures there. For those of you who've read Three Cornered War, I like walking around in the landscape. I like looking at visual images, paintings, and photographs, so I was doing a lot of that, visual culture. And then also looking at a lot of newspapers. I think I may have mentioned this to your group before, but newspapers.com is a tremendous resource. You have to pay for it, but I think it's worth it. Because, again, word searchable, I could search for Hayden Expedition or Yellowstone Expedition in 71, 72, and I could see which newspapers across the nation were reporting on his movements. It was incredible. Like, such an amazing database to be able to have. So as I was looking through all of these, I discovered that the story of the exploration and the preservation of Yellowstone is really several interconnected stories. The first being a story of scientific study and exploration. So if you like science and travel, this book is definitely for you. Also the history of capitalism, of capitalist development and investment, particularly in the West, and we'll see that specifically through the protagonist, Jake Hook. And you'll see why he has his fingers all over this situation. Indigenous sovereignty and persistence. Of course, Yellowstone was indigenous land before it was a national park. So Sitting Bull is a major protagonist in this book. His lands extend from the Yellowstone Basin all the way to the Missouri River, and he acts in defiance of the U.S. government throughout this period. This is also a story, as Reconstruction is in general, of the expansion of federal power. So how is the federal government using its power in the South and in the West to protect citizens and to provide things for them. And of course, there are some Civil War legacies, some sort of interesting connections between Civil War actions and individuals and the effort to preserve Yellowstone in this period. So many Americans really aren't aware that Yellowstone, as the nation's first national park, was created in 1872, right? Much earlier than you think, right? Most people think, probably 1890s, early 1900s, during Reconstruction, not during the Progressive Era. They also don't know that the legislation was signed not by Teddy Roosevelt, but by Ulysses S. Grant, right? He was president in this period. Of course, he had been a very famous, victorious general in the Civil War, had then become the general of the armies under Andrew Johnson, who he hated, and he had massive conflicts with all during Johnson's presidency. He had been a loyal friend to Abraham Lincoln, and so when he ran for president and was elected in 1868, he really was running to honor Lincoln and their friendship. He was a pretty dedicated, but somewhat moderate Republican. He wasn't a great politician. He was a really great general, as we all know. And we'll see how his sort of general nature comes out in a lot of these conflicts here. So in this period, Republicans held huge majorities in the House and the Senate. The South was just coming back into the Union. They had to, pass several amendments. They had to rewrite their constitutions. Not all of them were back. And a lot of them, when they came back, had Republican representatives and senators. And just as a reminder, you guys all likely know this, but in this period, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, as we know of today, were kind of flipped in their ideologies and in their focus. So the Republican Party embraced federal power, thought it was a force for good. They were really dedicated to protecting and providing rights for citizens in this period. And Grant was as well. He saw this as kind of making good on the Civil War's gains. What did all of his men die for, if not to protect the rights of all American citizens, right? So his campaign slogan, as you see here on this kind of electoral handkerchief, is "Let us have peace." And predominantly that meant peace between the North and the South, but it also meant peace in the West. Grant hoped that he would not have to resort to military action in the South or the West to secure those regions and their loyalty, but ultimately he did in fact have to. So in the South during this period, I'm going to go through this really quickly, but if you have questions at the end, we can definitely talk about it. Grant, in this period, was sort of getting all of these reports from his military guys, from his officers who were posted in the South, that there was this emergence of the Ku Klux Klan as an organized white supremacist organization that was trying to prevent Black Southerners, 4 million of them, from taking up the rights that they had gained in the war, right? With the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments, there was emancipation. Then the 14th Amendment secured them citizenship rights, and then the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. Right, so the KKK emerges in 1868, is really strong by 1871, what you'll see in the book, and they are pretty much acting on a regular basis to prevent Black men from voting, to prevent Black men and women from building their own houses, creating their own farms, doing anything that would suggest that they were equal citizens. Now Grant saw white supremacists as engaging in a second rebellion against the United States, right? He saw them as traitors to the country, traitors in the same way that they had been as Confederates. And so he had several advisors, was constantly talking with his cabinet about what to do about this problem. And South Carolina became the first theater of his war against white supremacy. In October of 1871, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus in multiple counties in South Carolina that had been particularly violent and turned over to the Klan, so that U.S. Army officials there could arrest Klan members, put them in jail, and keep them there until they were put on trial. In November and December of 1871, the KKK trials began. In the end, the government prosecuted successfully, convicted hundreds of Klan members. Most of them were rank and file. A lot of their leaders took off, left and hid, and some of them actually crossed into Canada and tried to claim sanctuary. Interestingly, they were convicted of seditious conspiracy, right? And the conspiracy to prevent fellow citizens from exercising their rights. So this was a very interesting part of the book to be writing during the January 6th situation, right? I was like, well, this is very eerie. This was, in this moment, an unprecedented act of federal power used to protect the rights of citizens who were not being protected by their state governments, right? In the West, and you can't really read this here, but this Harper's Weekly thing, where Grant is meeting with several leaders of various native tribes, it says, "Let us have peace," on the bottom of this. So we know that that campaign slogan is applying to the West and to the South. So Grant initially supported treaty negotiations with Native peoples across the West. There was a peace commission that set out in 1868. If you've read The Three-Cornered War, the group that includes Sherman came to Bosque Redondo, and they were part of that peace commission effort to establish peace treaties with all of the Native peoples in the Great Plains and the Southwest. But in 1871, Congress passed a rider in an Indian Appropriations Act, where they're kind of, getting the money to give to Indian agencies across the West. And it basically said, we will no longer make treaties. Instead, we're going to make peace agreements, which don't have quite the same legal standing, right? And they also don't recognize Native sovereignty. From that point on, the federal government would really make an overture toward peace. If that was rejected, which it often was, they initiated military action to force Native people onto reservations and force them to give up the vast majority of their land. So Grant increasingly was on board with this, especially in the 1870s in regard to the Lakota peoples under Sitting Bull, as we will see. So informing this evolving Indian policy during Reconstruction were a couple of federal projects, many of them with roots in the Civil War, including the Transcontinental Railroad, which, if you remember, I mentioned this kind of briefly in the Three-Cornered War, but it's always been so fascinating to me that the enabling legislation for the Transcontinental Railroad was passed in 1862. Same time as the Homestead Act, right? So here's the Republican Congress in the middle of the Civil War, in the wake of the battles for New Mexico, where the U.S. Army successfully pushes the Confederates out and regains control of the West. They pass these two measures that are meant to encourage white settlement of the West. And just as a reminder, the Homestead Act actually has written into the legislation that any American can take up 160 acres of land and buy it on the cheap if they improve it, if they are loyal to the Union. Right? So this is, former Confederates cannot take advantage of the Homestead Act. So this is part of that bigger vision on the part of the U.S. government and the Republican Party. So the Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed in 1869. So in the first year of Grant's presidency, provided much more rapid transportation for migrants and also for troops throughout the West. And it suggested that the East and the West were finally connected through this transportation corridor. Another development were what have come to be known as the Great Surveys. So geographical surveys had been American projects since Lewis and Clark, right? These are federally funded efforts. They send out a group of guys, some military, some civilian, topographers, map makers, some artists, some scientists. They send them out to different parts of the country to map those regions. Their intent was to determine the contours and the natural resources of the lands, most of them west of the Mississippi at this point, and their potential for future development, right? So they wanted to know what was there, but the surveys were really meant as engines of conquest. And they were meant to promote the white settlement of the West. They were not focused on land preservation. So this is something important to remember. 4 men emerged in this moment as leader of these surveys. John Wesley Powell, Civil War veteran, lost an arm at Shiloh, probably the most famous of the surveyors. Clarence King, who did not volunteer for the Army, even though he was eligible. He went west instead and started climbing mountains. George Wheeler, who was a little too young to volunteer for the war effort and was a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers guy. And then Ferdinand Hayden, who I will talk a little bit more about, well, not a little bit, a lot more about here in a second in more detail, who was a U.S. Army surgeon during the Civil War. There was also emerging in this period a kind of cultural project, right? Because here's the Civil War. Civil War's, kind of ending at different times at different places, and the country has to come back together. And so, people were thinking, how are we going to do that? How are we going to bring the North and the South and the West back together? So what emerges in this period is this belief in the idea that America is nature's nation, right? That the U.S. had spectacular, unique landscapes like Niagara Falls and Yosemite, and that this proved the nation's greatness. That this is, these are become the symbols of America. So surveyors were setting out to find these landscapes and kind of promote them as national icons, and to document them for the American public. So Saving Yellowstone tells the stories of this process, and 3 men in particular who staked their claims to the Yellowstone region in this period. So this is Ferdinand Hayden, who was born into poverty in Massachusetts. He was a child of divorce. Unlike many scientists of the period who came from elite families, Hayden really lived a hard scrabble life, kind of shuttling between his parents, and it made him really scrappy. He was ambitious and competitive. He was really kind of obnoxious. A lot of people didn't like him very much because he was very intense. He trained to be a geologist in the 1850s at Oberlin College, and he discovered on his first kind of field work trip to the Missouri River that he had this, and you wouldn't think that someone would have this kind of talent, but it does actually take a special eye. He had a talent for collecting and identifying fossils. So he could just look at the rock, see the fossils there, immediately understand how important they were, and pick them up, and apparently also a very fast walker. So he was just, when he went out on these collecting trips, he was collecting amazing specimens and a lot of them. So he became fairly well known to other scientists. He would go out, he would collect them, and he would sell this stuff to other scientists. But what he really wanted to do was lead his own expeditions. But during this period, the military was leading expeditions. So he could get assigned as a scientist, but he couldn't actually lead the expedition himself. His work was interrupted by the Civil War. He was actually profoundly annoyed by this interruption. He tried not to volunteer in the first year. He lived in the Smithsonian with a bunch of other scientists, and they kind of were dodging and weaving for a little while. But he finally signed up. He had medical training, because he had gone to medical school, which was the only way you could really become a scientist during this period. So he was assigned as a U.S. Army surgeon, first to Beaufort, South Carolina. Then he came back to D.C., and he ultimately ended up as a surgeon in the Army of the Shenandoah. So he served until the end of the war, and then was finally relieved when he got back and could actually be a scientist. So at this point, Yellowstone was one of the few unmapped places in the nation. Amateur explorers were getting in there in 1869 and 70, and Hayden didn't really want to miss his chance. He was hearing all these rumors, right, of like exploding water from the ground and like cliffs made of glass and like all the mud volcanoes. And he's like, what are these people talking about? But the whole idea of kind of volcanoes and the molten underlayer of the earth, this was a kind of new idea in this moment about sort of how the earth actually was formed and changed. And so he wanted to get in there. He wanted to figure this out. He wanted to make his mark in Yellowstone and claim Yellowstone for professional scientists. So he lobbied Congress for funding in the spring of 1871. They gave him $40,000, which is a lot. It's akin to about $1 million today, like getting a $1 million grant from the government. The goal was to explore Yellowstone, to map it, and to understand it, not to preserve it. The Congress wanted to evaluate it, the Department of Interior wanted to evaluate it for development. And for Hayden, he again really wanted to establish himself as the nation's foremost explorer scientist, and he thought he could do this in Yellowstone. So he had a lot of help from several federal entities, money from Congress, orders from the Department of the Interior, support from the Smithsonian Institution, which had been established in the 1840s. He secured reduced rates and free passes from the Union Pacific Railroad. So here's how that federal project comes in to support him. He also had support from the US military. He got supplies at forts along the way, including, most importantly, hardy Western horses and mules. He secured a protective detail of 2nd Cavalry soldiers from Fort Ellis in Bozeman. There was also an Army Corps and Engineers survey team out with him in the field. Along the route, expedition members purchased supplies and established depots at Salt Lake City, Virginia City, Montana, which was a mining town, and this place called Butler's Ranch, which was the sort of ranch site of these two German brothers. So he had kind of community buy-in here. He employed scientists, packers, hunters. He had a group I call in the book the political boys, who were all the sons of Republicans in Congress who had supported him and given him money. And then he hired a man who Hayden believed was his most valuable team member, Potato John Raymond, who was the cook. And although he never really acknowledged it, he would mention it every now and again, but didn't seem to really understand what it meant. Hayden's team was helped by the existence of indigenous pathways through Yellowstone that were already pounded out. He didn't have to kind of bushwhack his way into this region. He just had to follow the paths that had already been made by many indigenous peoples who had been using Yellowstone as a thoroughfare for years, right? So Hayden was a little bit abrasive, but he had several talents that made him an excellent leader of an expedition of this type. He had about 50 men by the time it was all said and done, and he wrote back to Spencer Baird at the Smithsonian that they were like an army on the march, right? And he would know. As a team leader, he allowed his men, his scientists, to create their own collecting teams. They could go out with whoever they wanted. He gave them instructions and expected them to work hard, but he did not crack down on them or really monitor them in any kind of way. So they had a kind of freedom to do what they wanted, which was a good tactic here. He was also a very good writer. He understood the power of language, of travel narratives in particular, and he played a role in the development of the popular science narrative as a genre as it exists today. So if you read any kind of pieces in the paper that are scientific in nature, if you read any travelogues that engage in science, Hayden had a role in developing that entire genre in this period. He also understood the power of both the written word and the visual images. This is a report he published in Scribner's Monthly. So he wrote a report for the federal government, he wrote a scientific report for scientific journals, and then he placed a piece in Scribner's Monthly, which was this big new magazine for middle-class readers. And it was illustrated by one of the men that he brought along on the survey, Thomas Moran, who I will talk about in a second. Because Hayden also understood how powerful visual images were, again, because no one had seen Yellowstone, right? So they were like, we're not gonna believe your word. Like, this sounds completely insane, right? So he knew he had to document all of these amazing geothermal features in Yellowstone so that people would believe they even existed. So he had help in this from William Henry Jackson, another Civil War veteran who had grown up in Vermont. He took to photography just as Hayden had taken to fossil hunting. They both had similar kind of talents and enthusiasm for those specific skills. He had served as a private in a Vermont company during the war, and then mustered out, went west with a wagon train in the late 1860s, and then started a photography studio with a couple of his brothers in Omaha, Nebraska. In 1869, he got his big commission to take photographs along the Union Pacific line, which had just been completed, to kind of promote it for the American people. He met Hayden during that period in Cheyenne, Wyoming. Hayden was out on another survey, and he met him there in a brothel. So there's a story about that in the book. It's very interesting. Hayden was a real admirer of Jackson's work. Jackson joined him on his 1870 survey to Wyoming, and so he recruited him to come along to Yellowstone. And Jackson just took hundreds of photographs of the entire trip, all the way along from Salt Lake City, all the way up into Yellowstone, and then took some of the most iconic photos of Yellowstone, even today, in these amazing photographs, right? This one, so this is Butler's Ranch, so this is one of their stop-off ones. This is one of my favorite photographs of Yellowstone of all time. If you've been there, you will recognize this as Mammoth Hot Springs, which they called the White Mountain at this point. What I love specifically about it is that this is Thomas Moran. Jackson was like, go out there and stand there so that we can have a sense of scale, right, of this massive geothermal work. And as I was reading about this, I was like, how close did we come to losing Thomas Moran? Like, he could have just fallen in and been scalded to death. I mean, this is completely insane, but they didn't care. And Hayden, in fact, did not lose anybody on this trip. One of his kind of older team members, a botanist named George Allen, who had been his professor, had to go home kind of halfway through because his health wasn't great, but he didn't lose anyone. No one died on this expedition, which actually, my agent was a little upset about that. It would have been good if there had been some serious conflict, but actually Hayden was such a good preparer that there really wasn't. Thomas Moran, who I mentioned a little bit earlier, had shown his talent for landscape painting pretty early. He was from an immigrant family from England and had grown up in Philadelphia. He was just emerging as a major painter on the scene in 1871. He also declined to volunteer for the U.S. Army. He went off to Europe instead and studied painting. When he came back, he painted. He worked as an illustrator for Scribner's Monthly, and Scribner's helped to pay his way to the Yellowstone expedition. Hayden actually didn't recruit him. He just kind of showed up in July as they were moving through Montana with a letter from the PR man for a railroad company led by Jay Cook. And you'll hear about Jay Cook in a second. Jay Cook helped to pay his way also. He ended up being probably the most valuable addition to this expedition, and Hayden was really glad to have him. He made watercolor sketches of all kinds of different features in Yellowstone throughout the trip, and then he painted his most famous painting, which is on the cover of the book, called The Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, a massive canvas, 8 feet by 12 feet. It's now in the Department of the Interior, and it was really this painting that brought Yellowstone fully into the American imagination. Congress actually purchased it for $10,000, the most that had ever been paid for a painting. In June of 1872, after we got back from the expedition, hung it in the U.S. Capitol, not far from Emanuel Lewitz's mural, Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way, which had been installed in the Capitol during the Civil War. And I just included this little bit. There are a bunch of little tiny figures. There's 2 tiny figures here, and then there are 2 in the shadows. The 2 in the shadows are meant to be Jackson and Moran. And then this is Hayden, and then a native guide who did not exist. They did not have a native guide. They're hunters and guides. Most were Anglo, one was Hispanic. But they did not have an indigenous guide. So Moran just made him up. Because it was very typical of this period in landscape paintings to include the kind of single native person, the vanishing Indian, who's sort of pointing out the landscape in order to leave it to white people, right? So it was a combination of Hayden's, It was a combination of Hayden's writing along with Jackson's photographs and Rand's sketches that helped congressmen to see what a unique and valuable landscape Yellowstone actually was. But the preservation of Yellowstone was not Hayden's idea. That honor belonged to the second of Saving Yellowstone's protagonists, Jacob. So Cook grew up in Ohio. He started working as a clerk at a bank when he was still in his teens. He was very good with numbers. He grasped the complexities of business and banking very early on, and by the time he was 40, he had opened up his own investment bank called J. Cook and Company. During the Civil War, he became immensely famous and wealthy for selling war bonds. So he was the one who sold all the bonds to support the United States war effort. Made a boatload of money doing it. In the years afterward, he cast about for a project that would be as challenging and as satisfying, and a project that would make him feel that same sense of patriotism, right? Like a project in support of the United States. And he hit upon the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was a national project intended to be the second transcontinental. It was called the Centennial Line. The Congress wanted to complete it in 1876. They chartered it during the Civil War. They wanted it in time for the centennial of the country. And J. Cook's brother Henry really believed that if they could really pull this off, if they could build the Northern Pacific Tract from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Coast through Portland, that it would be the grandest achievement of our times, right? Cook took control of the fundraising for the Northern Pacific in 1870. From the start, it was a complete disaster. Railroads are volatile investments in the best of times, and nobody wanted a piece of it. He had a really hard time selling these things, and so he went into like major marketing and PR mode. Like Hayden, he knew the power of publicity. He was placing ads in newspapers across the nation. He paid lecturers, including a guy named Pig Iron Kelly, who was a representative from Pennsylvania, who was in the pocket of all the railroad companies, to give talks about the Great Northwest and how everyone should settle there, how anyone could plant any kind of crop there. It was all fertile and amazing. Cook, like Hayden, was pretty determined. He was also very obstinate. He thought with enough advertising and promotion, the Northern Pacific would just take off. And he saw Hayden's Yellowstone expedition and the national park that Yellowstone could become as a boon to his project. And it was his PR man, A.B. Nettleton, who wrote to Hayden in October of 1871 about making Yellowstone a national park. So this is the letter. This is a picture actually of a microfilm reel. I didn't get to see the actual letter, but this is one of the documents I got to see in my 1 week in the National Archives. So this is the letter from Nettleton, October 27th, 1871, where he's saying, Judge Kelly, this is Pig Iron Kelly, has made a suggestion, pretty much it was J. Cook's suggestion, which strikes me as being an excellent one. Let Congress pass a bill reserving the Great Geyser Basin as a public park forever, just as it has reserved that far inferior corridor, the Yosemite Valley, throwing shade on Yosemite here, and the big trees. Because those have been saved during the Civil War also. Interesting. And then he says, if you approve of this, of such a recommendation, would this be, could you, talk about it in your official report of the expedition? And Hayden, who had come back from the Yellowstone by this time, with 45 boxes of specimens, he had to write a report for the federal government. He immediately saw the genius of this idea, that it would preserve Yellowstone as a scientific and exploratory laboratory for him for the future. So in November and December of 1871, Hayden and his scientific team, along with a group of boosters from Montana Territory, began to lobby government officials to create Yellowstone National Park. Hayden created a display in the Capitol Rotunda that included objects that they had collected during the expedition, Jackson's photographs, and a couple of Moran's sketches, like the ones that you saw. So there was like a little, mini Yellowstone exhibit in the Capitol Rotunda during this period. On December 18th, 1871, the bill to create Yellowstone National Park was introduced in both the Senate and the House simultaneously. It was different. It had a precedent in the 1864 Yosemite Act to create lands for the benefit of the public. However, the Yosemite Act gave those lands to the state of California to manage. The Yellowstone Act took land from Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho and gave it to the Department of the Interior to manage. So that's the big difference. That is why this is kind of landmark legislation. They meant it to be for the benefit and enjoyment of the people. There was debate about this. There were two major objections in both the House and the Senate debates that took place in January and February of 1872. The first argument was about federal overreach, right? An issue that is still with us today, right? This is one of the contentious issues that brought about the American Civil War to begin with. It was not resolved in that conflict. And Democrats were very concerned about this issue, and not just Democrats from the South, but from all over the country, especially in the context of Reconstruction, a period in which the federal government was really expanding its power in unprecedented ways. Most Republicans had no problem with the expansion of federal power in this context. Part of their party platform was federal supremacy, and they were interested in supporting and defending it, but moderates were a little bit wary. The second objection was that such an act would violate white settler rights, which had been affirmed in the 1862 Homestead Act, right? Every American citizen has the right to settle on and develop land. And was also the core idea in two of our country's most enduring and most powerful narratives, right? Manifest Destiny and the American Dream. So if you're going to say that Americans cannot buy whatever land they want and develop it, that's a big problem for those narratives, right? Both Democrats and Republicans, most from the Midwestern and the Western states and territories, upheld settler rights. America had a long tradition of doing so. And these rights were really seen as sacred, particularly in the West. And again, this issue is still with us, right, today. So the Senate, though, there was no roll call, so I have no idea who voted in what way, but it passed easily. But I would guess, given what happened in the House, that it was very likely not unanimous. They argued about these very same topics, and in the end, 89% of Republicans voted yes on the Yellowstone Act. Those who voted no were from all over the place, so there was no regional component to this. 70% of Democrats voted no. So this was not really a regional vote. Those Democrats who were voting no were from everywhere. The Republican strong majority, though, in the House meant that the Yellowstone Act, bipartisan but not unanimous, passed. On February 27, 1872, on March 1st, the bill landed on President Ulysses S. Grant's desk. He signed it without any fanfare. Most Americans approved of the Yellowstone Act. They saw it as something that could only happen in America. This kind of New York Herald announcement of the Yellowstone Act appeared in newspapers across the country. So people were very interested in this. There was a group of Americans, though, who were not on board with this or with any other plan to develop the West on behalf of white settlers. And those, of course, were Native peoples. So the third protagonist in the book is Tatanka Iyatake, a Sitting Bull, someone who most Americans, I think, know about, but only really associate with the fight against Custer, and perhaps Wounded Knee, and don't associate at all with Yellowstone National Park or conflicts with the U.S. government in this period. So Sitting Bull was born in the 1830s along the Upper Missouri River to a family of war chiefs and community leaders. Of all the people in the book, he is born into the most kind of elite family, has the most advantages kind of going into his life. He became a war leader of the Hunkpapa Lakota, which is one band of the Lakota peoples, who themselves were one part of what were known as the Seven Council Fires, or the Sioux. They were known at that time as the Sioux. The Dakota, the Yankton, Yanktonai, and then the Lakota peoples. So very large community of about 10 to 15,000 people in this period. So he grew up to be a widely respected leader. He was a war leader. He was also a diplomat. And he became, during the 1860s, a much stronger and louder voice for his people's rights and for native sovereignty in this period. And this happened for a couple of reasons. Some of them embedded in the Civil War. So the Dakota War, which was a war that the U.S. Army fought against the Dakota peoples in Minnesota. The Dakota, of course, were kin to the Lakota, and the U.S. Army pushed them west. And so the Lakota peoples took in a lot of their Dakota allies in 1862. In 1862, as I've already mentioned, we also see the passage of the Homestead Act, which starts to bring more and more white settlers into Lakota country, which again extended from the Missouri River to the Yellowstone Basin in what is now the kind of Dakotas and Montana. In 1863, there were gold strikes in Montana, which brought thousands of gold miners from both the west and the east into Lakota country. A guy named Bozeman built a trail called Bozeman Trail, which kind of took off from the Oregon Trail and went up into the mountains where Bozeman is now, straight through the heart of Lakota territory. And then it's not listed here, but in 1864, the Sand Creek Massacre, which was a U.S. Army action against Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples who were allies of the Lakota, became a kind of sensational moment in the history of the Great Plains. And the Lakota people swore to help their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies get revenge on the U.S. Army. So as I mentioned before, you could search these government documents to see who was coming up. And when you search Sitting Bull in the congressional serial set, he starts to appear in the 1860s more and more in almost every conceivable way. In Department of War documents, in Indian Agency documents, in letters from governors of the territories, in people who are doing mineral prospecting, in exploration and survey documents. And it's because he really began to assert his people's rights to their homelands during this period. He was engaging in peace talks, but often not coming to any kind of agreement. I was pretty consistent in resisting any kind of white settlement on his lands or people even moving across it. And Sitting Bull thus came to clash, as you might imagine, with Jay Cook's Northern Pacific Railroad surveyors, who wanted to lay track through his country right north of Yellowstone. So in the fall of 1871, he pushed a group of Northern Pacific surveyors out of the Yellowstone Valley and back to the Missouri River. In the summer of 1872, the Lakota fought 2 battles against U.S. troops who were protecting Northern Pacific surveyors, who were coming from kind of both directions to try and kind of chart this path for the railroad. And in August of 1872, he fought these 2 battles with them at Arrow Creek and O'Fallon Creek in what is now kind of, it's right around Billings, Montana. Again, succeeded in pushing the surveyors out and delaying the Northern Pacific Project. In June of 1873, Sitting Bull met George Armstrong Custer for the first time, as that officer was leading an Army detail protecting a Northern Pacific survey expedition west along the Yellowstone. So in the book, I really argue that these early fights really start him on the road to the battle with Custer at Little Bighorn, or what is known as the Battle of Greasy Grass. Of course, he was victorious in that moment, but it brought the full weight of the U.S. Army down in Lakota afterward. Ulysses S. Grant was really angry at this point and okayed an all-out hard war assault on Lakota peoples. The reason, and here's an interesting component of this, so the fact that Sitting Bull was able to kind of scuttle the Northern Pacific's plans actually brought about the Panic and Depression of 1873, because Jay Cook had been trying to lay this track, and he couldn't get anyone to invest in the railroad So he did what investment bankers are never supposed to do, which is he took money from his own investment bank and he gave it to the Northern Pacific. So by 1873, the Northern Pacific owed his bank and all of his investors $2 million, which it could not repay. And investors came calling in September of 1873. J. Cook and Company failed. It was not the first company to fail in that kind of wave, but it was by far the biggest, and it launched the Panic and Depression of 1873. So this is how Yellowstone is involved in that kind of epic moment in American history. Now, Sitting Bull, although he ultimately kind of ended up further east at Standing Rock Reservation, he and the Lakota people were not the only tribal nations who were laying claim to Yellowstone. This is a kind of larger map of all of the tribal nations, well, not actually all, there are about 27 now, tribal nations who claim a historic relationship to Yellowstone as a place where they hunted, where they fished, collected plants for various domestic and medicinal uses, where they held ceremonies. This is the source of many of their origin histories. And these tribal nations are still there. And they are still laying claim to Yellowstone's lands. And it's been interesting to see for the 150th anniversary how tribal nations are being integrated into the celebrations and into the story, telling the story of Yellowstone kind of on the ground. And they have been. Much to the credit of Yellowstone National Park and its superintendent, Cam Shaw, who has been very kind of open to and very kind of inclusive of Native peoples and their histories in Yellowstone. So what is the legacy of the preservation of Yellowstone National Park in this moment? Well, it was not immediate. This did not spark an embrace of conservation or preservation. In fact, just a month after passing the Yellowstone Act, Congress passed the General Mining Law, which permitted and still permits individuals and corporations to prospect on public domain lands and stake claims to mineral discoveries that they make there. Which is kind of wild to think about. They can still do that. Congress did not provide much funding for infrastructure in the park in the first decade. It was still extremely difficult to get to until 1883 when the Northern Pacific was finally completed. Up to that point, Yellowstone only had between about 500 and 1,000 visitors on an annual basis. Congress did not pass major preservation legislation, so there's an almost 20-year kind of gap here. Republicans, who still favored federal power and preservation, did not have firm congressional control until 1890. So that's one reason why they were able to get that done. This was also the year of the federal census in 1890 that declared that the frontier no longer existed. And as Americans, whenever we hear that we're not going to have something, everyone panics, right? I mean, just think about the great toilet paper during the pandemic, right? So, in response to that, Congress created 3 national parks in California. Yosemite, they finally created a national park, took it out of state control. Sequoia, and General Grant National Park. But it really took the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt after the turn of the century to make major strides in federal preservation. He really took off with that, made use of the 1906 Antiquities Act to use his presidential powers to just declare lands to be saved, national monuments, state parks, national forest preserves, all kinds of different things. But ultimately, Yellowstone did set the precedent for the creation of national parks and their management under the federal government. Also, because Yellowstone was saved so early on, and it allowed the government to kind of build around it Custer-Gallatin National Forest and Shoshone National Forest, what it functionally created is now called the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem, which is the largest intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world. And so Hayden's dream actually came true, because it is a scientific laboratory for scientists all across the world. They all come to Yellowstone to study all kinds of things, tree species, animals, water, rainfall, snow, all kinds of things. And there have been some really interesting climate change studies coming out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem because it was preserved so long ago. So what ultimately, do we learn when we look at reconstruction from Yellowstone? First, I think we learned that reconstruction was a political and an economic and a social project focused not only on the South, but also on the West. Right? It was an effort on the part of the federal government to unite the country from coast to coast through a variety of projects, including the exploration and preservation of Yellowstone. It also shows us that that this period, kind of 1871 to 72, was a moment in which the government was really reaching for a higher purpose, right? Before, unfortunately, abandoning it soon afterwards. Politicians would not use federal supremacy to protect Black civil rights again for almost a century. And Congress did not create any more substantial parks, again, for a long time, for almost 20 years. Seeing reconstruction from Yellowstone also allows us to see how the effort to explore and preserve Yellowstone rested on native land dispossession. This is a history of national parks we don't often hear about. But that indigenous peoples actually fought this effort kind of every step of the line. They survived, they persisted, they continued to defend their lands against commercial and federal encroachment. And finally, and I make this argument in the book, this angle of vision really reveals that Yellowstone itself was not only the world's first national park, but it was also, at the time and now, a perfect metaphor for the country. A place that is both awe-inspiring and also dangerous, both fragile and powerful, and a place where what lies just beneath the surface is always threatening to explode. And this is what we call hard history, right? It's not meant to undermine or contradict the love that we have for places like Yellowstone and to keep us from wondering at its beauty. But instead, I think it's really necessary that all Americans understand this hard history in order to appreciate its beauty fully, to understand the fullness of Yellowstone's past and its present. Thank you.